to 9/11. Well, we were attacked on that day, and so therefore, it sort of launched this enormous kind of round of anti-Muslim sentiment in the United States. Except that the numbers don't really bear that out. I know that, the attacks of 9/11 were many, many years ago. It's hard to believe. We're talking 14 years ago. But the truth of the matter is that the aftermath of that attack didn't occur the way that a lot of people think it did. There was no sort of massive backlash against Muslims in the United States. Yes, of course, there were isolated incidents. But what everyone expected to happen, surge of anti-Muslim violence, never actually happened after 9/11. On the contrary, what you saw in those days immediately after those attacks was a rallying in this country around its Muslim population. And by the way, you saw this even from the politicians. Spent an enormous amount of time in DC, in Congress, at counterterrorism, with the CIA, and what you heard at every level was the exact same message over and over again. If this is a conflict of ideas, if this is a war of ideas, which is what we keep saying it is, then we have at our disposal the most valuable weapon possible, which is a very large, fully assimilated, and successful Muslim population that gives life to this notion of a clash of civilization between Islam and the West. And the numbers bear themselves out. Those numbers that I was showing before were from the Washington Post. And what they showed was the further we got away from 9/11, the higher the rates of anti-Muslim sentiment grew. Which doesn't make any sense. Now we are 14 years away from it, and anti-Muslim sentiment in the United States is higher than it has ever been. So there must be something else going on. There must be some other reason for this. And the good people at the Center for American Progress figured out exactly what that reason is. This is, in reality, not a sort of naturally evolving process of fear and hysteria, but, as is most often the case in these kinds of situations, a very well-planned, well-executed, deliberate attempt to turn Muslims into an internal enemy by a very small cabal of individuals and organizations that have been funded, according to the Center for American Progress, to the tune of nearly $46 million. That report, by the way, came out 2 years ago, and by then I'm sure that number is even higher. They discovered that there are a handful of these foundations that have funneled millions of dollars into what they like to refer to as the misinformation experts. These are a handful of pseudo-scholars, almost all of whom, everybody on this page is on the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center's group of official hate group leaders, a list of hate group leaders. A handful of these pseudo-scholarly, individuals with these foundations behind them who begin to put together these reports about the Muslim menace in the United States. Some of these names will sound a little familiar to you. Robert Spencer. Robert Spencer runs a site called Jihad Watch. It's kind of like a blacklist that would make Joe McCarthy roll over in his grave. Robert Spencer, of course, is the same person who not too long ago said that the decision by Campbell's Soup to issue a line of halal soups was the first sign in the Muslim takeover of America. So, obviously he's a moron. That's our secret plan, is soup. Yeah, get you one can of soup at a time. Daniel Pipes, who's often referred to as the intellectual Islamophobe. This guy, of course, has a completely different idea about how to warn of this menace. Listen to what he's saying here. Read what he's saying here for a moment. Quietly, lawfully, peacefully, Islamists do their work throughout the West to impose aspects of Islamic law. Do you see what he's saying? Like, if you're noticing that Muslims are quiet and peaceful and legal, that's how they get you, right? That's the thing, is that it's all sort of this plan that they have. Frank Gaffney, who doesn't really deserve any breath, Richard Gabriel, you've heard these names before, right? These are sort of the best, the who's who. And of course, the screeching queen of Islamophobia, Pamela Geller, the same woman who in 2008, when Barack Obama was elected president, said that she had evidence that he was the bastard Muslim love child of Malcolm X. I'm not kidding. Look it up, Google it. These experts take these millions and millions of dollars and they issue these reports, is how they refer to them. Reports basically warning about the Islamic takeover of the United States. And then those reports get filtered down into what Fear Inc. refers to as the echo chamber. This is the media, of course. And again, these are very familiar individuals, people who have a very loud platform and who use that platform in order to spread this misinformation from these so-called experts. Glenn Beck, of course, and his chalkboard of crazy. By the way, just as an aside here, probably like the proudest I have ever been, like the highlight of my entire career was when I made it to Glenn Beck's chalkboard of crazy. It's just like a personal triumph for me. Anyway. And then of course, from the media into the pulpit, where it then gets disseminated to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. That's of course not where it ends. Because as this echo chamber begins to build up, it then becomes political talking points. And particularly during these times of elections, as we see, it becomes very much a part of the mainstream rhetoric against Muslims in the United States. Yeah. Right? 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 Like, what the hell is he talking about? The thinking man's Republican, he's called? What is this secular atheist country dominated by radical Islamists? Anyway. Yes, of course, Representative Alan West, Michelle Bachmann, Peter King, who very famously said that there are too many mosques in this country. All of this becomes a kind of self-fulfilled prophecy, right? The money that goes into these hate groups, the reports that the hate groups release, the way that then those reports are treated as though they are actual studies, scientific studies, and then they go into the echo chamber, and then they become political talking points. And then it becomes very, very easy, I think, for the average American to draw a straight line between, say, the violence that they see in Syria and Iraq, and the Muslim that they see in their neighborhood. But the point of all this is that it's quite deliberate in the way that it's put together. Now, there are obviously some serious consequences to this. This isn't just academic. We've seen these consequences take place around the country. From, the burning down of places of worship. Yeah, this is actually kind of funny. So, backstory about this guy. He got arrested for burning down a mosque, and the judge asked him, "Do you know any Muslims?" And he said, "No, I only know what I hear on Fox News." So again, you can draw a straight line from these players, this echo chamber, to these horrific actions. Erica Menendez, this idea that anyone who is brown is immediately seen as a Muslim. Of course, the man that she pushed in front of the subway train was a Hindu. Same thing happened with Ray Michael Page. The FBI concluded that he thought that the Sikh temple that he shot up was a Muslim temple because they were wearing turbans, and he just thought that Muslims wear turbans. And of course, perhaps most horrifically, the events that took place in Oslo with Anders Breivik. Killed 76 people, 70 of them children. And he did so very clearly citing in his manifesto the writings of Robert Spencer, of Pamela Geller. This was his motivation. It was very much a direct line, a direct connection between this rhetoric and these actions. Now, there is, of course, a reality behind this rhetoric, and that reality is kind of important. These are important things, important facts and figures for us to know. There are currently about 1% of the population of the United States is Muslim. 1%. So, maybe when we get to 2% we'll take over, but it's going to be a little while before that happens. 2% then the White House. Again. The demographics are very interesting about Muslims in the United States. Nearly 2/3 are first-generation immigrants. Now, this, of course, doesn't include what is often referred to as indigenous Muslims or African-American Muslims, but, the fact of the matter is that the first Muslims who came to the United States came here on slave ships. But what we mean is, for Muslims of an immigrant background, nearly 2/3 of them are first-generation Muslims. That's an extraordinary number, and it indicates precisely why so many of these sentiments, these anti-Muslim sentiments, are arising now. And it's very much linked to this immigration surge. But of course, of that number, 70% are U.S. citizens. That actually is the highest citizenship rate of any immigrant community in the United States. And of course, along with that, there are these other facts and figures. For instance, Muslims in America have the highest levels of education of any other immigrant community in the United States. They have the highest rates of literacy. They also have the highest rates of income. It might be interesting to know that the median income for a Muslim household in the United States is actually larger than for a non-Muslim household. As a matter of fact, JWT, an advertising giant, in 2012 released a report that said that the combined annual income of the Middle Eastern and Muslim American community in the United States is $170 billion, which is outrageous. I don't know where all this money comes from. It's like the three guys who invented, Yahoo or something. But nevertheless, that is an extraordinary figure, and it's important. It's an important matter because we actually, after all, live in the United States, and we've been told repeatedly that your money is your voice. Literally, in this country, the Supreme Court has told us in Citizens United that your money is your voice, and that's a pretty loud voice for this community. And I think that there's a larger conversation to be had about how that voice is being used, or perhaps not used. And insofar as this notion of, the assimilation of these Muslims, actually, when I think about it, this might be the biggest reason to think that there is something wrong with Muslims, frankly. They're highly assimilated, they've accommodated themselves into the United States. Now, of course, mostly when they bring up, Islam or Muslims, bring up this issue of violence. But there's something inherently violent about Islam, that Muslims have a completely different view about violence than people of other religion. That is absolutely true. Muslims have a far less tolerant view of violence than any other religion in the United States. Gallup proved this in 2010. The massive survey, they asked 10 questions about violence of Jews, Christians, Protestants and Catholics, Mormons and atheists. And in every single category, without exception, Muslims were the least tolerant of the use of violence. This is one of those questions about whether killing civilians is justified in a war. 78% of Muslims said it is never justified, compared to 38% of Protestants, 39% of Catholics, 43% of Jews, 33% of Mormons. The only group that came even close were the atheists. So there you go. And of course, so much of this is is not just about perceptions or misperceptions about Muslims or Islam. It has to do with very legitimate fear. People see the news, they see war and terror, and they're afraid. And so you get the sense that somehow their lives are at risk when it comes to terrorism. But that actually is also not true. Because none of you are going to die by a terrorist. None of you. You have more to fear from your lazy boy than you do from a terrorist. But you would never know that, when you're listening to the news or you're paying attention to the rhetoric that's out there. So this is the reality of this community that is being demonized, this community that is being referred to as foreign, exotic, this community whose values are seen as conflicting with American values, this community that is seen as wholly other. None of that is true when you actually look at the data, when you look at the information available to you. It's just that it doesn't really matter, because data, information, knowledge, these things have a role, they have some importance, but they are not the tools for affecting change. They certainly are not the means of actually transforming people's perceptions. I would love to sit here and say that the answer is education, the answer is knowledge. Those things are important. I have to say that. I'm contractually obligated to say that. The chancellor's here. I have to say that. But they don't work in changing people's minds. Why? Because bigotry is not a result of ignorance. Bigotry is not a result of a lack of knowledge. We like to think that that's the case. We like to think that someone's just a bigot because they don't know any better, but that's just not true. There are actually very well-educated, very knowledgeable bigots in the world. And the problem is that we think that bigotry resides up here, when in reality, it resides in here. Bigotry is a result of fear, not a result of lack of knowledge. And fear is impervious to data. Fear is impervious to information, right? I mean, if you have a kid, you know that this is true. No matter how many times you explain to your kid that there is nothing underneath the bed, right? You can all look under the bed, you can shine the light down there, there's nothing there. That doesn't change anything. In the same way that no matter how many times you can tell someone that Barack Obama is not a Muslim, no matter how much information that you may have, no matter how much data you can show, it won't actually affect them. I used to say that Jesus himself could come down and run as Barack Obama's running mate, and it wouldn't make a difference, because then it would be, a Muslim and a Jew, and that's not a winning ticket. See, the problem with anti-Muslim sentiment in the United States, it's that it's a reflection of what's happening in America. It's a problem with America. It's a problem, a crisis of identity, right? I was talking about those moments in which we have some sort of societal stress. And that's what we're in right now. The problem isn't with Islam, it's not with Muslims. As a matter of fact, this is an old story. Everything that's being said about Muslims today, that they are foreign, that they are exotic, that they're un-American, that they're an enemy within, that they cannot be trusted, everything that's being said about Muslims today was said about, for instance, Catholics, the end of the 19th century. This was an era in which anti-Catholic hysteria in this country had reached hyperbolic levels. We passed laws, actual federal laws in this country trying to curb Catholic immigration into the United States. It was perfectly mainstream political rhetoric to say that you cannot be both Catholic and American. How can you be loyal to both the Pope and the President? You can't be loyal to the Vatican and the Constitution. You cannot be both of these things. Again, that wasn't fringe behavior. That was not fringe rhetoric. This was perfectly mainstream rhetoric. Catholics don't look like us. They don't act like us. They don't pray like us. They are not us. What does it mean to be American? In a great part of the end of the 19th century, it meant not being Catholic. That's what it meant. And yet, of course, today, Catholics